At 25,000 feet above the burning deserts of North Africa, the sky was already filled with thunder. Engines roared in tight formation. 4 Wright Cyclones hammered the thin air as a group of American bombers pushed deeper toward enemy territory. Below them, the Mediterranean coastline faded into a haze of dust and anti-aircraft smoke. Black bursts of flak erupted like volcanic explosions around the formation. Inside one bomber, the crew felt the aircraft shudder violently. Flak. 12 o'clock high. The radio crackled through static as the bombardier tightened his grip on the Norden sight. The aircraft held its course. Bomb run meant straight and level, no evasive maneuvers. Then something appeared out of the sun. A German fighter screamed toward the formation, closing fast. Its engine howled as it lined up the attack. Gunners opened fire, .50 caliber machine guns hammering the sky. Tracer rounds streaked past the fighter in glowing arcs. But the pilot never pulled away. In a desperate final moment, the enemy aircraft slammed directly into the tail of the bomber. The impact sounded like a mountain splitting apart. Metal tore open. The rear fuselage exploded into twisted fragments. The entire tail section of the bomber seemed to vanish in a cloud of debris and smoke. Inside the aircraft, instruments spun wildly. The control column shook in the pilot's hands as the bomber lurched violently downward. By every law of physics, the aircraft should have broken apart. No bomber could fly with half its tail missing. Yet somehow, impossibly, this one didn't fall. The crippled aircraft staggered in the sky, barely holding together, its rear fuselage shredded and its stabilizer hanging by twisted metal. What happened next would become one of the most unbelievable survival stories in the history of aerial warfare. This is the story of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress that refused to die. The shock of the collision echoed through the bomber like an explosion inside a steel drum. For a moment, nobody spoke. The aircraft dropped sharply, its nose dipping toward the desert far below. Loose equipment slammed against the fuselage. Cold air howled through the shattered rear section as the sky itself seemed to rush inside the aircraft. The pilot gripped the control yoke with both hands, fighting the violent shuddering. Control. I still have control, he muttered, almost in disbelief. Behind the cockpit, crew members looked back toward the tail, and what they saw should have meant the end. The entire rear section of the aircraft was nearly gone. Where a solid fuselage should have been, there was now a jagged opening of torn aluminum and twisted structural ribs. The vertical stabilizer leaned at a terrifying angle, shaking violently in the slipstream. At that altitude, any structural failure could rip the bomber apart instantly. And yet the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress continued forward through the sky. Slowly, unbelievably, the pilot began to stabilize the crippled aircraft. Around them, other bombers in the formation stared in stunned silence. They had just witnessed something that should have been impossible. A bomber that had lost half its tail was still flying. By the early years of World War II, strategic bombing had become a central pillar of Allied war planning. Factories, rail yards, oil depots, and shipyards powered the Axis war machine. Destroying them from the air could cripple an enemy's ability to fight. But bombing heavily defended territory was brutally dangerous. Enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns turned the skies into lethal traps. To survive that environment, the United States Army Air Forces needed a bomber that could fight its way in and out of enemy territory. The answer was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. First introduced in the late 1930s, the B-17 was unlike anything flying at the time. It was large, heavily armed, and engineered with an almost obsessive focus on durability. Its nickname, Flying Fortress, was not propaganda. It carried up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, positioned to cover nearly every approach angle. Nose gunners, dorsal gunners, ball turret gunners, waist gunners, and tail gunners formed a defensive web of firepower. Enemy fighters approaching a bomber formation had to fly through storms of tracer rounds. The aircraft could cruise at around 180 to 200 miles per hour, with a range exceeding 2,000 miles depending on payload. It could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs deep into enemy territory. But the B-17's greatest strength wasn't its guns. It was its ability to absorb punishment. Its aluminum airframe was heavily reinforced. Critical systems were duplicated. Fuel tanks were positioned to reduce fire risk. Even with engines damaged or control surfaces crippled, many B-17 crews discovered their aircraft could still remain airborne. Still, even the Flying Fortress had limits. And on February 1, 1943, one aircraft would be pushed far beyond them. The bomber was nicknamed B-17 All-American. Assigned to the 414th Bomb Squadron, the aircraft took off during the Allied campaign over Tunisia. Its mission was to strike enemy targets supporting Axis forces fighting across North Africa. The sky over the target quickly turned into chaos. German fighters, primarily Messerschmitt Bf 109 interceptors, climbed to meet the incoming bombers. These aircraft were fast, deadly, and flown by experienced pilots defending their territory. As the American formation approached the bombing run, flak began bursting around them. Black explosions ripped through the sky. Shrapnel hammered against fuselages like steel rain. Then the fighters arrived. One German Bf 109 dove toward the formation at high speed, targeting the B-17 formation with a head-on attack, a common tactic designed to exploit the bomber's forward blind spots. The bomber gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked past the incoming fighter. But something went wrong. Instead of pulling away after firing its weapons, the German fighter continued directly toward one bomber, the All-American. Whether the pilot was wounded or had lost control remains uncertain. In the next instant, the fighter crashed straight into the bomber's tail section. The collision was catastrophic. The rear fuselage of the B-17 was nearly severed. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers were ripped apart. The tail gunner's position was destroyed. Control cables snapped and twisted through the wreckage. From nearby bombers, crew members watched in shock. They were certain the aircraft would explode or disintegrate. Instead, it kept flying. The tail section hung loosely, barely attached by fragments of metal skin and structural spars. Inside the cockpit, the pilots fought desperately to keep the aircraft stable. The controls responded sluggishly. The bomber drifted downward before slowly leveling out. Amazingly, the remaining structure of the aircraft held. Even more incredible, the bomber began turning back toward base. The crew could hardly believe it themselves. Hundreds of miles still separated them from friendly territory. Behind them, the tail of the aircraft flapped violently in the wind. Any sudden maneuver could tear it away completely. Enemy fighters could have finished the crippled bomber easily. But by sheer luck, the attackers had broken off. Slowly, painfully, the shattered B-17 limped across the Mediterranean sky. What should have been a falling wreck became one of the most extraordinary flights. Even enemy pilots knew the reputation of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. German fighter crews often reported bombers returning to England riddled with damage that should have destroyed them. Missing engines, shredded wings, shattered control surfaces. But the survival of the B-17 All-American pushed that reputation into legend. When the crippled bomber finally approached its airfield, ground crews stared upward in disbelief. At first, many thought they were looking at a wreck that had somehow wandered out of the sky. The aircraft's rear fuselage was almost completely destroyed. The tail section sagged at an unnatural angle. Large sections of the stabilizer were missing entirely. And yet, the four engines continued to roar. The pilot lined up the landing carefully. Any sudden movement might tear away the fragile remains of the aircraft's tail. The bomber touched down. Its wheels rolled across the runway. And against every expectation, the aircraft stopped safely. All but one crew member survived. When mechanics inspected the bomber afterward, the damage stunned even experienced engineers. The tail structure had been held together by little more than thin sheets of aluminum and twisted support beams. By all known engineering logic, the aircraft should never have stayed airborne. But this impossible survival revealed something important about the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft had been designed with extraordinary redundancy and structural strength. Damage that would destroy other bombers often failed to bring down a B-17. Throughout the war, dozens of photographs would emerge showing flying fortresses returning home with missing engines, shattered wings, or fuselages riddled with hundreds of holes. These aircraft did more than drop bombs. They brought their crews home. Strategic bombing campaigns over Europe and North Africa relied heavily on this resilience. Day after day, formations of B-17s flew into some of the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. German fighters and anti-aircraft guns took a terrible toll. Yet the bombers kept coming. Factories burned. Railways collapsed. Oil supplies dwindled. The ability of aircraft like the B-17 to survive damage and complete missions played a crucial role in weakening the Axis war machine. But statistics and strategy only tell part of the story. Because behind every flying fortress were 10 men, pilots, gunners, engineers, navigators, and bombardiers, sitting inside a fragile aluminum shell thousands of feet above enemy territory. They trusted the aircraft with their lives. And sometimes, against all odds, that trust was rewarded. The story of the All-American became legendary not simply because a bomber survived catastrophic damage. It became legendary because it represented something deeper. Endurance, engineering brilliance, and the quiet determination of crews who flew into danger knowing that survival was never guaranteed. In the violent skies of World War II, thousands of aircraft were lost and thousands of airmen never returned. But on one extraordinary day over Tunisia, a shattered bomber refused to fall. And for a few impossible hours, a broken machine carried its crew safely home through the sky. A reminder that sometimes in war, against physics, against probability, against fate itself, the impossible can still fly. Stories like this spread quickly among bomber crews across Europe and North Africa. Photographs of the shattered aircraft circulated through air bases, briefings, and newspapers. Pilots studied them carefully, sometimes with quiet relief, because every crew climbing into a bomber understood the same terrifying reality. Once they crossed enemy lines, there was no guarantee they would ever return. Yet aircraft like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress gave them something priceless: hope. Hope that even when engines failed, when flak ripped through the wings, when fighters tore apart the fuselage, the aircraft might still carry them home. The survival of the B-17 All-American became more than a story of engineering. It became a symbol. A reminder that in the chaos of war, resilience, both human and mechanical, could sometimes defy the limits of the sky itself.